Well, in the Bible story, sometimes God's people are constituted as a kingdom. So at times they are the people of Israel living in their land, and they live under God's rule and under God's king. And there you fully expect that the society will be shaped by God's standards and God's rules. But for significant periods, God's people found themselves in exile, living in a foreign country. So, for example, they found themselves in Egypt under the rule of Pharaoh, or in Babylon under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. So God's people found themselves living in a pagan country where they were a tiny minority. And I think that's very parallel to the situation that the church finds itself in today. In fact, that's the New Testament would say is the normal situation of the church. We are strangers and aliens in the countries of the world. So the Bible teaching about exile helps us to understand the normal situation of what it means to be a Christian, which means that in those sort of accounts of God's people in exile, they have to live under a pagan ruler who doesn't necessarily uphold Christian standards. And they try to live out lives as good citizens in that context, obeying the rulers as far as is consistent with their obedience to God, speaking prophetically of Jesus and the good news of God and sharing that message with the society and with sort of the rulers themselves. So we see Daniel doing that, for example, in Babylon, where he seeks to point Nebuchadnezzar to the God of the Bible as the one true God. They seek to be a blessing to the society around them. Jeremiah told his people when they were in exile to settle down, to seek the prosperity of the city, because if the city prospers, then they themselves are also able to prosper and to be protected. So that model of living in exile is very helpful to Christians. It also reminds us that there will be times when we have to be willing to disobey what government and rulers might say if it's inconsistent with what God's word tells us to do, and we need to then be prepared to take the consequences for that. So again, we see in the exile in Babylon how Daniel was unwilling to bow down to the false idols of the Babylonians. His friends refused to bow down to the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar had erected, and Daniel himself refused to stop praying when that was forbidden by the king. The result was that God's people who were faithful did experience punishment. So it wasn't that they could expect to disobey without consequences, but they felt that standing firm in their witness to God was more important. And of course, in the New Testament, Christians had to do that when they were commanded by the Roman state to worship the Roman emperor. And Christians refused to worship the emperor, and as a result, large numbers were martyred because of their unwillingness to worship the king. So I think those provide good patterns for Christians about how to live in a world where we're under the rule of pagan non-Christian rulers.